When it comes to mixing, one of the most powerful ways to add size and depth to your tracks is to use reverb. But when used incorrectly, reverb can very easily make your tracks sound muddy or distracting. So in this video, I'm going to reveal 3 of the most common mistakes that I frequently see people making with reverb, and I'm going to provide some insight for what you can do to prevent yourself from making these mistakes and instead end up with mixes that sound pro and polished. My name is Mike Inavina, and I run MasterYourMix.com, where I've helped teach thousands of musicians and engineers how to create pro-level mixes from their home studios. And in my time doing this, I've had the opportunity to review countless mixes from my students, and I frequently notice that a lot of them tend to make a lot of the same mistakes when it comes to using reverb. Now, like I said at the very beginning, reverb is a very powerful tool, but if you use it incorrectly, it can very easily ruin your tracks. Now, I frequently hear people mention that when it comes to their mixes, they're not happy because they tend to sound muddy or they lack the polish that a lot of their favorite records have. But often, the culprit isn't things that they think it is. It's not things like EQ or compression that are causing the issues. Instead, it's reverb. So in this video, let's discuss the top 3 mistakes that I frequently see people making. Mistake number 1 is choosing the wrong reverb decay time. Now, typically when it comes to choosing decay time with your reverb, people tend to run into one of 2 mistakes. They either set their decay time too short or too long. So let's first talk about choosing a reverb time that's too short. So when you choose a reverb time that's too short, often what you're going to end up hearing is you're going to hear the effect of the reverb, and the decay of that will end before the next note. And if there's too much of a space between when the reverb time ends and the next note, it's going to become very distracting because you're going to hear these loud bursts of room tone and ambience, and then all of a sudden silence. And so that can become very distracting. Often you want your reverb to add ambience to your track, and you want it to make your track sound like it was recorded in a specific room. So you don't want this room sound to disappear between notes because that will get very distracting very easily. So that being said, if you're hearing that effect, you would want to go with a longer reverb decay time. Now, if you're trying to choose a longer decay time, you have to be very mindful of how long that goes on for. Because if the reverb tail is too long, what ends up happening is the effect of the reverb starts overlapping the notes that follow it. And when that happens, your mix will start to sound very muddy very quickly because you're going to have all of this compounding room tone building up on top of itself and building up on top of everything else that's in the mix, and it's going to become very hard to hear. So the solution to all of this is that you want to set your reverb time so that it ends right before the next note. You want it to sound very clean and very consistent. So the easiest way to achieve this is to use a decay time calculator. Now you can just simply find these online, and all you need to do is just enter the tempo of your song and it'll spit out the time values in milliseconds for how long a quarter note is or an eighth note, that kind of stuff. So you'll want to find the time that works with the music that you're working on. And you basically just set your reverb time based on these quarter note calculations or eighth note calculations, whatever it is. And what that's going to do is that's going to let the decay time go as long as that note needs to go, and then it's going to stop just in time for the next note to be hit, and then you'll end up with another clean tail of reverb in between all these notes. And that's just the easiest way to make sure that your mixes don't end up sounding muddy because of having too much reverb overlapping everything. So definitely make sure to use a decay time calculator because it will definitely help. You can certainly use your ears as well, but having a decay time calculator will definitely make sure that it's most accurate. Mistake number 2 is not having consistency in what you're sending to a reverb. And when I'm talking about this point, I'm mainly referring to groups of instruments. So let's say, for example, you've got a drum track and you add a reverb to a snare only. Well, the problem with this is that if you have your reverb really loud in your mix, every time that snare's hit, you're going to hear this massive room sound. But then when the cymbals and the kick drum and the toms are hit, everything's going to sound too dull. And the issue with this is that it's going to make everything sound disconnected from itself. Now, you want to use reverb on drums to make it sound like they were in a room together. But if your snare drum sounds like it was recorded in a canyon and the rest of the drums sound like they're in a closet, it's going to become very distracting and jarring. And you definitely don't want your tracks to have that disconnect. Same with vocals too. If you have a lead vocal that's really washed out and has a lot of lush reverb time going on, well, that could sound great on its own, but if your background vocals sound really dry in comparison, they're not going to work together great as a unit. So you definitely want to make sure that you're considering what you're sending to a reverb and think about it in terms of the group. And you want to send things so that they sound consistent within that group, because otherwise it's just going to start to sound like everything was recorded in a different space, and that can become very distracting over time. Mistake number 3 is having too much reverb in your mixes. And this can happen in a variety of ways. The first way is the obvious one, which is just simply having your reverb way too loud in your mix. And when this happens, you end up with mixes that sound very muddy and washed out. You don't want your reverb tracks to be super loud because it's going to mess with the perception of depth in your tracks. And it's going to get in the way of the clarity of your drier, more close mic tracks. So definitely be mindful of how much reverb you have in your mix as a whole. The other thing is if, let's say you have reverb only on a couple specific tracks. So maybe you've got it on your snare drum track, for example, and you've got the reverb volume really loud. Well, in that case, it's going to make that snare drum track stand out a lot because it's going to be the only one that has that extra depth and decay on there. And it's going to stand out like a sore thumb because none of the other tracks are going to have that. So you definitely want to make sure that you set your volume of your reverb so that it isn't so noticeable and it's not used as much of an effect. The easiest way to set your reverb volume is to simply start off with your reverb on its own track and set the fader volume all the way to the bottom. And then just slowly bring it in until you start to notice a little bit more ambience and depth to your tracks. The idea here is that if you hit mute on that track, you want to notice that it goes away and you don't have as much depth, but you don't want it to feel like the whole mix just completely changes. You just want to have a little bit of that extra depth and presence in there, but not make it sound like your entire mix just crumbles completely apart. So that's all you need to do. Just start with it really low and just bring it in until you start to feel it. The other way that you can have too much reverb is by using too many different types of reverb. Now, the whole point of using reverb is to add ambience to your tracks. And if you use different types of reverbs that have different decay times or different EQ structures to them, well, it's going to get very distracting very easily because you're going to hear all of these simulated reflections and they're going to be very disconnected from each other and they're not going to sound very cohesive. So instead, what you're much better off doing is choosing 1 or 2 reverbs that work really well with each other and sticking to only those and sending your tracks just to those 2, as opposed to having a different reverb for the drums and a different one for the vocals and a different one for the guitars. All of that stuff will become too distracting because you're going to hear way too many reflections. So keep it simple, just choose 1 or 2 reverb types, and then that'll make everything sound much more cohesive and consistent. So there you have it, guys. Those were the top 3 mistakes that I see people make when they're mixing and using reverb. So hopefully you found that helpful, and if you did and you want to learn even more about how to create mixes that sound professional and polished and do it from your home studio, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com, and on that website I'm currently giving away something I call the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint. This is a guide that teaches you all about how to use EQ and compression in your mixes to get even more clarity. So if you combine all that with all of the reverb tips that you learned here, you're going to learn to create some professional, clear sounding mixes that have that polish and that sound pro. So definitely make sure to check that out, masteryourmix.com, and it is a free download called the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint. So make sure to check that out, and if you like this video, also subscribe to this YouTube channel. That way you can get notified about any videos as they come up. So hopefully you found that helpful, and we'll talk soon, guys. Take care.